Hey everyone, today we're going to be taking a look at the Hindostan Whetstone. These are a really interesting type of American natural stone that I think are probably one of the most underrated natural whetstones available and can serve a wide variety of applications if you so choose. It is, and rather was, sold under a variety of different names. Hindostan Whetstone is usually how we refer to it now, but it could be called the Hindostan Oilstone, the Orange Stone or Orange Oilstone. It also got sold under the Canada Oilstone moniker, and the Pike or Norton Fast Cut Sharpening Stone. Now, in this case, when they're Pike Fast Cut stones, they're almost always Hindostans, but if they are the more modern, air quotes, Norton version of the fast cut stone, they could be a Hindostan or they could be a synthetic stone that they released which replaced their Hindostan fast cut stones. So you have to watch out for that if you're particularly looking for a Norton fast cut labeled one. So nonetheless, there are some designations to the name when they were sold. Unfortunately though, they were not labeled usually not even in the shop. They were sold in piles at the shop that had a label for the pile. So you see almost no Hindostan whetstones with labels of any kind or stamps. It's not going to be that type of a situation. We can make some broad inferences based on how it looks, but as with most natural stones, using it is going to be what really tells you what variety of Hindostan whetstone you have in your hands. So anyway, let's take a look at this stone, its formation history a little bit, and then we'll get into using it in a variety of applications and see how it performs. So let's go ahead and just take a look at one of these first. One of the really interesting and fairly telltale things about the Hindostan whetstone are these laminae layers that we see here. These are formed because of the tidal rhythms of the ocean, and as such this type of stone is called a tidal rhythmite. And as we can see, there are light and dark differences between the layerings and thick and thin differences between the layerings. These are caused by the high tide and low tide differences of the Pennsylvanian era 300 million years ago, when this silt, clay, marine plankton life remnant combination was swept up by the tide. So when we look at this, the thick layers are from high tide, and the thin, darker layers are from low tide, and the thin, darker layers from low tide have a higher concentration of clay in them, a minute amount realistically speaking, but enough to cause the variance that we see in the side of the whetstone. So while many whetstones may have this type of stratification or layering, you don't always see it, versus in these Hindostan whetstones, almost all of them are going to have this type of layering. And this layering is generally referred to as an alternating couplet because they are made over one day. So when we look at this type of a stone, we can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So it took 6 days for this stone to be made, and of course it was actually part of a far larger block. So it's really interesting. It is a little bit different than how other whetstones were made. Of course relative, but it's really cool to be able to see it. And actually, if we take a look at, let's compare two that are easier to see. If we compare these two, hopefully the camera will zoom in, you can see that the alternating couplets are different sizes. And this does not play a role in how the whetstone will perform, but it does tell you, if you want to be a geologist about it, where the moon was at the time of the stone's creation. And a matter of fact, those layerings are so accurate that you can go back and for all of the Hindostan material, you would be able to tell exactly what the lunar cycle was based on how the alternating couplets were laid down in the stone. So not every stone has that type of interesting formation or linear or lunar knowledge integrated into the stone, and I quite like it. And obviously, if you think about the fact that one of these layers was a single day, a lot of this stone was created in a very short period of time. In one of the quarries, they estimate that a 10-foot tall block was formed over just a single year with all these different layers. So pretty cool background. They came from a variety of mines, not just the Hindostan mine, but when they were first sold on the market, they were first commercially exploited in a large sense, not just regionally, out of the Hindostan town, and thus it got its name as the Hindostan Whetstone. There's some pretty interesting history there as well. The Hindostan Whetstone actually far outlived the Hindostan town because the Hindostan town itself, early on, still in the 1800s, went through some sickness or localized pandemic and was wiped out. So a lot of the Hindostan stones that we use may actually not be from the Hindostan quarry, but one of the other surrounding quarries, which I think there were at least 5 or 6 other ones that functioned for a very long time. So when we look at these stones, and when they were sold, they actually were sold in a variety of gradings, though again, much of that is lost today. We'll start at the bottommost grading, which is what is generally referred to as the orange stone variety. These do tend to be the easiest to identify by looks, though it can be very difficult to understand exactly how a Hindostan whetstone will work based on looks. However, when you find one that's like this, it's fairly busy, it's very tan, it's more likely to be the orange stone variety. And in this case, almost all these fast cut, whether Pike or Norton, were of that variety. That means they're going to be a little coarser and, again, very fast cutting. If we use terms for like a Japanese whetstones, they would be in the early to mid Nakatoishi range, and realistically speaking, faster cutting than anything that you find in Japan in that range. They can often keep up with some of the more notoriously fast-cutting whetstones, like a Cretan or Turkey stone, certain cauticles, and the faster Washitas, though of course those prime examples of those other stones will still be even faster than the Hindostan. And if you want a very fast-cutting variety of these, you want to look for these orange ones and you want to use it with oil. When these are used with oil, it keeps the abrasive in the stone from wearing out as quickly, and it keeps it cutting for much longer. Alternatively, though, if you want to get a very wide range out of the stones, you want to get a more generic Hindostan, which are usually these orange, or not orange, these more gray colored ones, and they still might have some coloring in them, and you'll want to use water. This will mean that you'll have to refresh the surface of the stone a little bit more often, but it gives you a very wide range in performance. That's one of the things that the Hindostan whetstones really come into their own on, and outside of maybe certain cauticles, might have a very impressive range compared to other stones. I would say that out of all of these three, these two, and then maybe this one here as well, we could make it work as a 800 to 1K if we condition the surface with a 140 grit diamond plate and use a good amount of slurry. It'll be very fast and fairly aggressive. Or we can use thin slurry to no slurry, lighter pressure, and let the surface wear out a little bit. It'll still cut, but it won't be at super fresh, and we can take it all the way up to about a 6K. So realistically speaking, this could cover the entire middle range, Nakatoishi range, if you're using the Japanese terms. And that is a very impressive range, and they are actually able to even, on the nicer specimens, particularly like for us here today, these two, you could get your razor to a shaving edge. Now, it's not going to be the keenest thing in the world, but it would be more than serviceable, and after a strop, it'll pass hanging hair test 4 to 5 if you do that type of thing. But in general, it will give you a good shave that is fairly forgiving, not as aggressive as it could be though. And that's where, of course, your better finishing stones would take it, further than that across the finish line. So one of the drawbacks to these whetstones is their lack of grading. So kind of like when you're shopping for a caudicle or talking to people about their experiences with a caudicle, Washitas also kind of fall into that category as well. You can't be sure unless if the seller is trusted and can give you tests that the type of Hindostan you're going to get will do exactly what you want it to. These do have a little bit more forgiving qualities to them than cauticles because it's a lot it's a lot more on you about how you condition the stone and use slurry. So in a way, it lends itself a little bit better to being able to be manipulated into how you want, but particularly if you're looking for one that can, in theory, do razors or take your knives fairly far, you can't just grab any of them. You need to have someone do a little bit of tests, and you're looking for the finer grain, smoother, harder ones in that case. They make fantastic knife stones, though, and in my case, though, I will use them all with water, and that brings us to the second issue that these stones can have, which is almost always in the past, what made a good whetstone was speed, was purely speed. A lot of woodworkers or craftsmen had access to things like Charnley Forest stones, Welsh slate, hard Arkansas stones fairly readily, and their issue was not how fine they could get their tools, it's how fast they could get them up to speed to cut the metal. As such, these were fairly popular stones for a period of time, not as popular as the Washita or Cottacles. I suspect that's partially because these do wear out faster. They, both the whole stone itself and the abrasive particle, you need to condition the surface a little bit more. And if you were in a workshop doing blade after blade after blade, if you get 2 more blades on a Cottacle, or even 1 more blade on a Washita, it might be worth it over a very long, large amount of them. Consequently, though, these are fairly absorbative stones. They'll really suck in water or oil, and the vast majority you're going to find on the secondhand market will have been used as oil stones. Because again, that oil stone, using as an oil stone will speed it up, will keep the abrasive from wearing out, and since that's what everybody wanted back then, there were no synthetic stones, it means that that's how they were used. Usually what that means is you got to go through a degreasing process, and some of them, like this is my hardest, densest, finest one, you see that it has this staining. There's actually no oil really left in the stone, but we can't get away from the staining that the oil left behind. Some of them do clean up nicer. For instance, this one was cleaned up, but we still have a little bit of those marks. And it is possible this one was never used with oil, as well as this one was never used with oil. So you can find them, but you'll have to ask around and see if anybody has one or something. The vast majority, though, will be oil stones. You'll have to degrease yourself, but they do also degrease fairly well. You just put them in some simple green for a week, scrub it, and then keep doing that over and over again until you're mostly degreased. You're good to go. The best way I find to do that is to put it in simple green and then let it dry, scrub it with a brush, and then let it dry in the sun for a day, and the oil on the inside of the stone will expand out, and then you degrease again and rinse and repeat until you're fairly happy with the end result. I know that some people will use oven cleaner, or there's another one called, I think, Purple Power, that's stronger, but the simple green has always worked well enough for me. This is a very interesting Hindostan that I have here. You don't usually see them in this very colorful variety. Matter of fact, this is, I think, the only one I've seen that looks like this, and I'm very lucky to have gotten it. So it's a very good performing stone. So as I kind of implied, they are stones that absorb a decent amount of water. As such, if you're going to use them with water, it's not a necessity to soak them. We'll give you a for instance. Let's get the box out of here. So it sucked up some water. Not a huge amount of water, but it is clear that it is a little thirsty. And I do think they benefit from just a minute or two of soaking, so that when you're using them, you're not having to go back to your spray bottle and really have to treat it too much. If they are just retaining a little bit of water, it helps to just make them easier going to work with. So we will go ahead and get these soaking, and then we will do a polish test. We'll do a sharpening test, which these guys are okay on polishing. I think that when you compare these to some of the better Nakatoishi stones from Japan, something like an Aizu, I tend to lean towards these stones for sharpening because they're going to be faster and they will have that greater range. For razor bevel setting, we're going to be deleting the scratches anyway. You're working with very hard metal, and again, that speed can help to move things along because you're not going to put a lot of pressure. I would lean towards Hindostan to set your bevel and get your process going. For cladded knife polishing though, and we will do that later today, but for that I tend to lean towards the Japanese stones, primarily because they are a little less aggressive and they will leave a more shallow scratch pattern. And at that middle stage Nakatoishi stone, you want that more shallow scratch pattern because it will be easier for you to clean up with your subsequent progression steps. So I do think that they play different roles, but a lot of people look to the Aizu as a fantastic kitchen knife stone. And I think that if a lot of people checked out the Hindostan whetstone, they would find it would take over that application in lieu of the Aizu. I think they'd be quite surprised. So anyway, we are going to go ahead and get these soaked, and we'll come back in 5 to 10 minutes, and we'll do a polishing test first, sharpening test, and then I will pull the razor out just so you can see what it looks like. I don't have a microscope yet for this practical application, but we can still tell a lot from how it cuts, looking at the bevel reflection, and I may try the hanging hair test. We'll see how it goes. It's a little difficult in this area with the light. So as always, before we get soaking, I'll just show you what type of polish we're dealing with today. This is not as far as I normally would take the blades, because these are kind of middle grit stones. I didn't feel as obligated to take this, you know, all the way to a perfect finish to then undo. But it's a fairly decent, if not quick, Avocado polish, and it will serve our purpose here for having deleted any previous scratches that would be in the Hindostan level of scratch pattern. So that's what we're working with and where we will start in our testing application. So let's go ahead and get these soaking, and then we'll come back when they're done. Alright, so we've had it soaking for about 5 minutes. I didn't time it, but feels close enough. I'll leave the other ones in there. We'll use some of these for a variety of applications. We'll go ahead and try this one first. This one is, I feel, the most standard Hindostan. It's just an orange, or really primarily a tan gray off color with a tiny bit of orange in there. No particular speckling or anything in the surface. It's just a very standard middle ground Hindostan, both in how it will be used, will react for us, how it feels. You know, I think this is a good average example. So we'll try it first without making any slurry. I think it would benefit from some, but let's try without first. So yeah, see how it's doing this? Where it's getting kind of stuck in the pores of the stone. That's where some slurry could help us to just keep that abrasive moving out of the stone, but we've already started. And as I use the stone, it will cool down some, as I indicated, but you can see we're getting very good cutting performance. Okay, so I mean that was from a freshly resurfaced layer of the stone, and it was resurfaced with an Atomo 140, so it was going to be a little aggressive to start with there. And here's what we end up with. And as I kind of indicated, a little bit deeper than an Aizu off the bat, but if we kept going on the stone, it would cool down a little bit, and still a perfectly usable stone even for polishing if we want. But that speed is definitely another level from the Aizu. And unlike some other stones, it does do well if we wanted to use slurry on it. It would work with us very well, and that is key. You do definitely want to use slurry when you are sharpening or setting a bevel on your razor. So we're going to go through the process here. I'm going to go ahead and grab what I would say is kind of the second average stone. And this is pretty interesting. These layers of stone are known for having a lot of fossils in them, and particularly what they call like worm-looking fossils are talked about in a lot of old geology books. You can see them here. They look like kind of bacteria under a microscope lens. Nothing super special, but it's always interesting when you get to see them in the stone. Oh, that's a really good example of them right here. Alright, anyway. That is one thing I like about them. I think they're very... Though they are dull colored, except for that pink one, the average of them will be fairly dull. They have pretty cool history. The sides are really interesting. And you do get them where it does have, once they're wet, some pretty interesting hidden features, if you want to call it that. This is, again, another fairly standard one. Let's see what we get. Maybe a little softer than the one before, insofar as how quickly it abrades, pulls up material. In this case, actually, so it's just not the same thing. Let's go ahead and get some slurry going. Which, as you can see, they're a little hard, even with this being a softer one. Doesn't look too much different, but it just helps to keep those metal particles moving, not clogging up the stone, but also not making you have to use oil, which would do the same thing for you. Again, the slurry here, maybe it doesn't change the concept of what we're going to get out of the stone a whole lot, but what it does do is it keeps it cutting for longer. So I definitely think this one was a little coarser than that one, which is what we were going to expect. You can see it's definitely acting a little coarser. And I would say it more than average for a Hindostan. If we kept using it, though, it would turn more like the one that we had just seen in the first place. I also suspect that one is the least degreased, and that plays a role as well. So if you do have a Hindostan and you find that it's not acting as fine as you would like, check to see if you feel like there's any oil still in there. And if there is, removing that might be helpful. So this one should be the fastest and the coarsest. We might have a little bit of a problem, just it's a very small stone. It's much more built for, putting in like a camping utility kit or something. Not particularly for sharpening or polishing, rather. We could do okay with sharpening because my hand is going to be very close to the ground, so we'll see what we get, but I'll do my best. It just might be a little tough because it's pretty close. I don't know if it's coming through, but definitely sounds coarser. We need some more water. This is a little bit of a flaw of small stones in that they just hold less water on their surface. So they don't have any reserve pooling around the sides to kind of pull in as you're working. All right. And definitely, I think, hopefully it shows through on the camera. But insofar as scratch depth is concerned, I think this one is the deepest. Though it looks like maybe it's a little more consistent than the previous one we tried. I still think, though, that that might be down to a bit of oil residue in the stone. But if we look here, there's some scratches right around here that are definitely deeper than the other two. And that's to be expected from the, coarser orange stone variety, which despite the name, they might not always be orange, they just are more commonly. So on these stones, these last two stones, I tend to use them for razor bevel setting more than anything else. We will still polish with them, but they are on the finer side of things, and what we'll do is we're going to use the 1200 plate to make our slurry instead of the 140. That does change the dynamic of the stone a little bit, but not dramatically so. And once you work it for a little bit, you still see that underlying scratch pattern coming through, regardless of if we used the 1200 on the previous one or this one. What it does do is it makes the surface a little less friable, and that means that we'll get less of the stone coming up, and there'll be a thinner slurry on the top. If I felt, though, that we would have gotten different results on those first stones, I would have used the 1200. Truth be told, I don't think we'll get too much different results for these than if I use the 140. All right. Still a pretty good cutter, but you can hear obviously that there's that difference. Still very respectable speed on the stone. Also, as they get harder, as you see, they don't get as thirsty. Let's go for one more round. So those previous stones maybe would have been below an Aizu, more like a Binsui or a Igarashi, and they could have worked themselves up to an Aizu if we had kept going. This is much more in the Aizu plus range, and if we keep going, it would give us maybe like a Tsushima or Mikawa Nagura, the lower level ones, finish. And it's never going to be scratchless, but those scratches definitely get a bit more refined. On this one, they're definitely shallower. That's very hard to show here, but hopefully it comes through. They are indeed more shallow scratches. And one nice thing is that they're very consistent, because the strength of the cutting speed, it really knocks out any high or low spots you have rather quickly. They're very good for that. Even if you used it before an Aizu, the Hindostans can do a really great job helping you even out your polish if you just mess it up a little bit after the initial, maybe synthetic stages. Let's take a look at our last one here. And these two are definitely at the finer end of things. This one is above average, but this last one here is well above average. And it is very common for the ones that are harder and finer to be more, I guess, pure gray. I mean, if we take a look, it's a much, outside of the staining of the old oil, there's really not a lot going on. There's not a lot of dots or features or anything like that. But I will, of course, warn, as always, that it's very hard to make that conclusion. You really got to use it or have people show you conclusions before you trade for one or swap or purchase one or whatever you're doing. Definitely, if you can get some more commentary from someone whose opinion you trust, that's the way to go. All right, let's see what we get. And as is the case, this might be a little hard to get on camera. There is a difference. I've got some residue left over. It's fairly similar still. I do notice that we have a little bit of oil residue here, which is discoloring it up here. That's alright, that'll come off. And realistically, the last two are fairly similar. This one in practice is a little harder feeling, though. Alright, so when we talk about, before we get into sharpening, when we look at these and say, you know, what did they used to be graded? And if we line them up in hardness to, or fineness to coarseness, like this. Generally speaking, the way that they would have been labeled in a store would have been as, at the coarsest end, a orange stone. In the middle area, we would have what's called a number 1 Washita, or I'm sorry, number 1 Hindostan, which is obviously like a Washita grading. We would actually have a Washita-like Hindostan, literally called that. So you can see that when these were out, the Washita Whetstones were still very popular, or rather Washita Oilstones were very popular because they said, hey, these are similar. And then this would be what's called an export quality. But again, very few labels existed or very few stamps existed, so you're almost never going to find that. That's just how they would have been graded back in the day. So what we'll go ahead and do is I'm just going to get these cleaned up, and we'll just maybe select like this one and this one as the middle ground, but opposite ends of the middle ground. So we have one that's a little finer, we have one that's a little coarser, but not at those farther ends where you're less likely to find them unless if you search them out. And then we'll do some sharpening on each, and then we'll probably use this one just to see how it pulls up razor swarf and show the extent that it can do there. All right, well, just give me a bit to clean up and we'll be back. All right, so I just got everything wiped down. We're back with our, what would be a number 1 Hindostan. Now, it's really not generating all that much slurry, just the way that Hindostans are formed, it takes a little effort to get it out. And a lot of people who've used them, you know, if you use sandpaper, you'll be really surprised at how quickly it will blow through the sandpaper. It's very durable in that format. So, all right, we're just using our guy here, but in this instance, we're just looking for how fast it cuts on average to coarser leaning. This steel is about 62 to 63. So, not crazy hard, but fairly hard. Not too much pressure. Not none either. Just average, I guess. So you can see the stone, in this sense, clogs up a whole lot less, which makes sense. We're not pressing as much metal against it and removing as much. And of course it slows down a little bit because we're not pulling off the soft cladding, but it still makes a very respectable edge. And this is always what people are talking about when they want something for kitchen work. It's fairly refined, but it still has some toothiness to it, which is what everybody's always talking about for Aizu. That it hits that middle ground of fairly durable, it'll catch through things as you want, but it's not going to be so aggressive that it can't make your fine cuts for you. So, one of the things we talked about earlier is obviously that they have a pretty good range to them. So in this case we've washed off that slurry, and we'll keep going on the same one. Now, of course, the surface has already been somewhat exhausted from our previous run through, so we should definitely expect slower cutting. And if you had wanted to return that cutting, easy enough, right? Just refresh it. Or you could use oil. If you used oil, we would not see it nearly as exhausted as it currently is, but that's up to you. I'm not a big oil fan. So it's a bit more refined. I mean, it's much harder in this capacity to be able to express refined versus not refined differences. And one thing I would note is if you have not removed your burr by the time you're using slurry on this, you definitely don't want to go to no slurry. This is a refinement stage at this point. You know, we're not cutting all that fast anymore. It's acting much finer. If you had a burr still on here, this is not going to remove it. So keep that in mind. You'd have to more aggressively condition the surface and use that slurry, and it'll definitely deburr for you there. And we can still hear it was still coarse. Coarser than our other variety here, which again, this would either be an export quality or Washita quality. And they're still not that far different. You know, just a small shift within the middle grit range. But in this case, we are still going to use the 140 on the first one to give it a more coarse experience. We're going to use the 1200 on this one for that a little bit finer. And of course, you could take the one we just used and use the 1200 for sharpening. You will find it gives you still a bit finer experience, but the grain inside the stone, if you look at it under a loupe, just isn't as tight. Also, you can actually see that this is pulling a bit of metal swarf off the background plate of this, which is why it comes out fairly gray looking. If you have a Nagura or anything, Hindostan Nagura, that would be fine to use here and you would avoid that, but I don't, so I don't have one. So you should be able to hear the difference between the two. Though the swarf was already gray, it's much darker now than it was before. And it cut very well. This is a good stone. And it definitely is a difference than the other one. You could get them, though, again, to be a lot closer if you conditioned the surface of the other one with that 1200 more readily. But this would be much more what you'd expect out of a Tsushima Nagura or a very coarse, soft Awaseto edge. It's very nice. This is much closer to what I like. The other ones, I usually use the coarser ones only to do deburring on knives or something. I would use them a little finer like this, but that's me. For people who talk with me, I lean towards everything being a little bit on the finer end of things. I just find that works better for my sharpening methods. So, okay. I suppose we can do a water-only one just to keep some level of consistency between things. Now, to be expected, this harder one doesn't cut nearly as well without slurry, and that's something you'll find too for sure. The other one still had a little bit of cutting performance left. Its refinement level was different. This one, I mean, you really wouldn't want to stay on this for too long this way, but it still definitely kicks it up a little bit. But if you're on this for too long, you know, and you're don't have a fairly steady hand, or you still have that burr, of course, you're a lot more likely to roll your edge or get something unusable. But that range right there, that little bit of extra, you know, you're not going to find that with an Aizu. When an Aizu exhausts, is not really going to continue affecting the edge in a positive way. Versus this, throughout that slurry range, we got probably further than the Aizu would. And then definitely this still does something. Even though we didn't generate a lot of swarf, it's still affecting the way the teeth work on the edge of the blade. So let's go ahead and get this rinsed off. I'm going to just generate a little bit of slurry, and again, no microscope, so it is of course a little bit more subjective, but let's go ahead and take a look at 1200 slurry and a razor. Now this will work even with these finer ones to set a bevel on a razor because they're so fast with slurry. I would tend to avoid the coarser ones for razor work. They could work, but I think you'd really want to work on that surface conditioning a bit and make sure that they're the way that you want them to be. Versus the harder, finer ones just lend themselves to it a bit better. And it's definitely pretty natural for the slurry to sound a little sandy. Hopefully you picked that up. But almost all that is just from the slurry mixing, I find. If we look at the edge, we're not going to see chipping. We're not going to see any major rogue scratches. It'll be a consistent pattern. But you do want to use these a bit like you would a caudicle, where you slowly dilute the slurry until you have almost none, then do a bit of water-only stuff. And as we're using it, the surface is getting, because we're not using oil, the surface is getting smoothed out some. The abrasive is calming down. And by the end, we'll be able to get it to, like I said, pretty much, I mean, if you were in a, you know, desperate situation, I suppose, you could definitely get the razor to finished. It's just not the way that most people are going to want it to be. Most people want the maximum screaming edge, versus this is, it could do it. It could shave. And not just like, oh, it technically shaves arm hair. I mean, it would pass the majority of tests you want besides the silent chop of the hair. It'll probably pop the hair instead. So I'm not looking for a whole crazy honing session here. Just a little bit of an example. When I start to feel it catch a little bit, for almost all my stones with razors, I like to transition to a little bit for the hand to make sure that it's not an angle problem. You'll hear some people talk about, you know, when the stone starts causing that friction, you're done. But I find in a holder like this, it doesn't have any suspension, and definitely human error is a possibility. Alright, let's see what we were able to get. Alright, sorry about that. Had to plug the camera in. But we can take a look. I'd already wiped it off. Here's what we're dealing with. And what you want to look for is the spine right here to give you an idea of the type of scratch pattern that we've got on just the hard metal. I know it's very hard to see, but it's the best I can do without a microscope, which I don't have yet. So, all right, we can try some form of hair test here, but I feel like they're always very hard to see. I've tried them on the camera before, so I can't promise you're gonna be able to see it. So let's just try a regular hair cut with going across. Alright, popped off pretty good. Let's try down. So I think this is what most people would call 4, right? It pops. I don't know if I have enough here. I don't think this little one's going to get a... So we'll just do another cut. We got a split, but I can't blame that because it's the tiny hair. So that's what you get out of one of them. Now I will say, if we get all of them, you know, back out here, anything downwind of this one, will have a very hard time getting to that. They're more of a pure setup, versus these two can kind of get to that level. But you do have to watch out for wire edges. You know, it's very easy to kind of overhone when you're using stones via a certain level of burnishing, which is kind of what we're doing, right? We're using the stone and we're using it on water and having the surface abrasive material wear out a bit. And when, you know, that's burnishing. You're slowly burnishing the stone, and then you're getting it to polish and cut at the same time. And the more you do it, the less it's cutting, the more it's polishing. And that can get you into a situation where you've worked the edge for too long. You might start seeing it curl, or certain areas get flexible, and you don't want that, especially for a razor. So just be mindful, but there's a lot of stones out there that you're going to be partially burnishing to get the best results out of, and a lot of people don't do that. They're not doing that to get those maximum results, and then they'll use it once and go, wow, this stone can't do that. And really, people should be testing that far. You just can't be too, you know, you can't go too long on them. You can't go for 300 strokes. You'll eventually run into those problems. So that is the Hindostan Whetstone or Hindostan Oilstone. One last thing I suppose to cover at the end, because I forgot to cover it at the beginning, which is why they have the name Canada Oilstone. So at one time in the 1800s, these were exported to England as the Hindostan Whetstone, and originally they were fairly well received, but the second major shipment that went to the United Kingdom was, you know, labeled Hindostan. But the import authorities thought that it was referencing somewhere in India versus somewhere in the United States. I don't know why that matters at the time, but apparently it did, and they dumped all of that stock into the Thames and stopped importing the Hindostan because they felt it was a product from India. So the miners and sellers of the Hindostan Whetstone started to import it to Canada and then have it rebranded there as a Canada Oilstone, and then sold to the United Kingdom, where it was rather successful under that moniker. So if you get a Canada Oilstone, it's one of two stones. It's either one of these Hindostans, which have most of them are going to have these striations on the side, or laminae, or there's another stone called a magog that's from an island in Canada that performs very similar, but does not tend to look the same and isn't as sandy silty, even though they are about the same performance level. My understanding is that it feels a little different, but I don't have one, so that's all secondhand information. Well, I hope you enjoyed learning about the Hindostan Whetstone. If you did, like the video and subscribe if you got this far in it, and thanks until next time.